I'm Srishti Rau, and today I'll be talking about patterns of mental health risk and XY variations. Just a little bit about myself. I am a pediatric neuropsychologist at Children's National, and I collaborate with Dr. Armin Rosnahan's team at the NIH in the section on developmental neurogenomics. And our lab aims to study the conditions that arise during childhood and affect thinking, as well as social, emotional, and behavioral health, with the goals of identifying ways that might help to improve prediction, detection, and treatment of those conditions. So I just want to take a couple of seconds to review what are the goals and objectives of today's talk. I'm going to start by giving a brief review of what's been done previously in terms of mental health and XY variations. Many of our colleagues at institutes across the United States and Europe have been doing really important research in this field. But often they're looking at one aspect of mental health across several XY variations, one aspect of mental health within one condition, or they're looking at psychopathology broadly, but in one XY variation or one condition. So our group was really interested in trying to examine multiple aspects of mental health across multiple XY conditions. And the data and research that I'll be presenting today represents a portion of the findings from a paper that we recently submitted for review entitled Patterns of Psychopathology and Cognition in Sex Chromosome Aneuploidy. And I'll conclude the talk just by kind of pulling together what were some of the big picture take-home points from our study, and then also what are some of the clinical implications of our findings. I'm going to try really hard to avoid using scientific jargon, but there's some terms that are unavoidable. So I do want to take a few moments to talk through what some of these terms mean. So to start with, aneuploidy means the presence of an atypical number of chromosomes. So in our study, we focused specifically on sex chromosome aneuploidy, and we were looking at mental health in different groups with an atypical number of sex chromosomes. So the expected number of sex chromosomes for females is typically XX, and for males, it's typically XY. In our study, we focused on 3 groups of trisomies, meaning they had one extra sex chromosome, and those were trisomy X, XXY, and XYY. And we looked at one tetrasomy group, meaning there were 2 extra sex chromosomes, and that was XXYY. Another term you're going to hear me use a lot is psychopathology, and that really just means the study of disorders of mental health. And there's a couple different types of classes of symptoms within psychopathology that I'll be talking about. So internalizing symptoms are characterized by negative emotions, and these include things like depression, anxiety, and phobias and fears. And externalizing symptoms represent a class of symptoms where there's problems with self-control of emotions and behavior that affect the external environment and the people in the environment. So these include things like aggression, defiance, noncompliance, tantrums, rule-breaking behaviors. Another term you're going to hear me use a lot is CBCL, which is an acronym for the Child Behavior Checklist. And this is the questionnaire that we used in our study, and it has a little over 100 items, and parents respond about their own child's social, emotional, and behavioral functioning on this questionnaire to all of these items. And then their responses are sort of collected, and then they use those responses to have, they derive scales of psychopathology based on the responses. And if any of you have actually come through our study at the NIH, you may remember filling this one out because it was the blue form in our study. And finally, control group means a comparison group that the condition is being, or the comparison group without the condition that's being studied. So in our case, we were comparing individuals with sex chromosome aneuploidy to those who had the expected number of sex chromosomes. So in our condition, typically, in our study, typically developing controls were females with XX and males with XY. So in speaking about prior work that's been done looking at mental health in XY variations, broadly speaking, presence of extra sex chromosomes increases risk for challenges with mental health compared to individuals with the typical number of chromosomes. Previous research suggests there's some patterns of difficulties across different dimensions of psychopathology that depend on the XY variation that was being studied in the research. So when we look at X aneuploidy conditions, meaning individuals who have an extra X chromosome, they show higher rates of ADHD, with the inattentive symptoms being more pronounced than hyperactive or impulsive symptoms. And there's also higher incidence of internalizing symptoms such as anxiety and depression, as well as social difficulties. Y aneuploidy conditions also show higher rates of ADHD, but in their diagnosis of ADHD, there's also symptoms of hyperactivity, and there is a higher prevalence of externalizing symptoms such as tantrums, difficulty tolerating frustration, aggressive behavior, and Y aneuploidy conditions also show difficulties with socialization and social skills. And then XXYY, which has both an extra X and an extra Y chromosome, also have higher rates of ADHD with impulsivity. And these individuals also show a combination of internalizing and externalizing symptoms, as well as social difficulties. So they have tantrums, they tend to also have difficulties with anxiety and mood regulation and social difficulties. So what I want to draw your attention to the fact that what remains constant kind of across the different types of XY variation conditions are challenges with attention and socialization. I also really want to take a moment to emphasize that what I'm describing from prior research and also what I'll be describing in our study is these findings are derived by looking at groups of individuals with the same condition. However, those groups really are comprised of individuals, and each of these individuals has their own patterns of strengths and weaknesses. So there's a lot of variability in the types of psychopathology we see within individuals with the same condition. And so a single individual's experience or profile can get overshadowed by what we see as like the overall trend of the group. So if you're listening to this talk and you're thinking, well, I know somebody who has an X aneuploidy and also has temper tantrums, this is not meant to downplay your experience or that individual's experience, but just to kind of preface that our research is really based on looking at the average across a group, and that can sometimes overshadow an individual's variability that may be different from the overall group's pattern. So in introducing the study that we completed, we looked at 241 individuals, and their age range kind of spanned throughout childhood into early adulthood. And these were almost 5-year-olds up to 25-year-olds. And the parents of these individuals completed the CBCL. So it was parent or caregiver report about their child or young adult. And the table here shows the number of people that were in each of the groups. Both the top 2 lines show the typically developing controls, and then the bottom 4 lines indicate the aneuploidy conditions and how many were in each of those. All right, so I'm going to take a moment to explain this very busy graph, and I'm going to try to use a laser pointer to do that. Here we go. So over here on the horizontal axis, these are the different domains of psychopathology that are measured by the CBCL. Each colored line here represents a different aneuploidy group. So the green line is trisomy X, the orange line is XXY, and together we're kind of collectively calling these the extra X conditions. The bluish purplish line is XXYY, and the pink line is XYY. And even though XXYY has both an extra X and an extra Y, collectively we kind of thought of these two, the blue and the pink lines, as the extra Y conditions because they showed similar patterns in terms of their psychopathology profiles. And then also down here, what I'll draw your attention to is these first three scales sort of comprise the internalizing components of the CBCL. And then in the middle, there's social, thought, and attention problems. And these don't actually fall on either externalizing or internalizing. And then on the right side here with rule breaking and aggressive behaviors are the externalizing symptoms. The vertical axis of this graph represents the score that was assigned to the particular scale of psychopathology, and higher scores indicate that the parent was reporting more problems with that domain. So just broadly speaking, consistent with what previous research has shown, when we compared CBCL scores between the aneuploidy groups to the control groups, meaning XX and YY, that are the lines for those groups are not pictured here, all four aneuploidy groups had higher scores on all domains of the CBCL. So it's not pictured here, but if I were to have drawn in the lines for the typically developing groups, the XX and XY groups, they kind of would have been down here somewhere, falling kind of right within the normal expected range. And also, the other thing that I want to draw your attention to is that with the exception of a few scales, we generally see that the extra X conditions, which are trisomy X and XXY, they show a similar pattern. They kind of dovetail with one another. And both of them are peaking at attention problems and to a lesser degree, social problems. Similarly, in the extra Y conditions, so XYY and XXYY, we're seeing that the two lines sort of run somewhat parallel to one another, and they're also peaking at social problems and attention problems. And just overall speaking, these two lines are running at a higher level than the extra X condition lines, indicating that the extra Y conditions, the parents of these individuals are reporting more challenges across these different domains of psychopathology. The other important thing I want to point out here is that our study actually does not replicate prior research that suggests that trisomy X and XXY or the extra X conditions have higher rates of internalizing symptoms, and conditions with an extra Y have higher rates of externalizing. So what you can see is the portions of the graph that I've circled, these lines are not really highly differentiated from one another on this side nor this side. What we really find is the scales that differentiate the extra X from the extra Y conditions are these scales in the middle. So the social, thought, and attention problem scales are really what are differentiating the four aneuploidy groups, or the extra X and extra Y conditions, as opposed to the internalizing and the externalizing scales. All right, so this is another graph that is from our study, and this is essentially the inverse of the previous graph. So on this graph, we had on the x-axis or the horizontal axis, the different CBCL scales, and the lines were represented by the different aneuploidy conditions. This is the inverse, where on the horizontal axis, we now have the aneuploidy conditions, and the different colored lines up here are representing the different CBCL scales. And so the scales are the same exact 8 scales that were along the horizontal axis on the previous graph. And just like on the previous graph, the vertical axis here indicates the score from the CBCL for the particular domain, and higher scores indicate the parent was reporting more problems with that domain. So when we look at the aneuploidy groups only, and then we compare the patterns of CBCL scores, we observe something interesting. So what I want to draw your attention to here is that the scores for the different CBCL scales are kind of close together. There's not a lot of variability here in the extra X conditions. However, when we kind of come over here to the right side of the graph and look at the extra Y conditions, you can sort of see that the scores just kind of fan out. There's just a lot more dispersion and variability in what parents are reporting on the CBCL for the individuals that have an extra Y chromosome. And just like what was shown on the previous graph, what we see is that the highest scores are for across all aneuploidy groups are for the social and attention problem scales. And so regardless of which aneuploidy group we're looking at, those are the lines, the purple and the yellow lines that tend to peak the highest, and that the extra Y conditions, those peaks are even higher than the extra X conditions. So in kind of pulling it all together, the conclusions and implications of this study indicate that individuals with XY variations are at a higher risk for social, emotional, and behavioral challenges across all of the scales that were measured in our study compared to controls, or typically developing males and females. What we do find is that different types of aneuploidy present different patterns of risk. So our findings really reinforce recommendations from prior research that to ensure that psychological screening is included as a standard of care when working with individuals with XY variation. So for example, pediatricians should be doing rating scales of social emotional health and behavioral functioning, and then referring out for additional evaluation or treatment as indicated if the scales are elevated. So somewhat contrary to prior work that suggests that extra X conditions tend to have internalizing symptoms and extra Y conditions have externalizing symptoms, in our study, the parents are reporting the highest level of challenges with socialization and attention, kind of across all of the XY variations. And we actually thought that this was kind of an interesting but not unexpected finding. One possible reason for this observation is that the X and Y chromosome they have genes on them that influence development of parts of the brain that play a role in processing social information. And so it may be that any kind of disruption in the X and Y chromosome, or the addition of extra X and Y chromosomes, really disrupts the development of these parts of the brain that subserve social processing. Also, while the social and attention problems were elevated kind of across the board for all of the aneuploidies, we find that the conditions that have an extra Y chromosome are especially vulnerable to challenges in these domains. And work by previous groups indicates that there's higher rates of diagnoses that show challenges with social skills and attention. So for example, autism and ADHD. Individuals that have extra Y chromosomes tend to have higher rates of autism and ADHD when we compare them to the general population, but also when we're comparing them to individuals with an extra X chromosome. And also finally, the last kind of take home point here is that there's more variability in the types of psychopathology we're seeing in the extra Y conditions. So this is speaking to just the fact that those different CBL scales, the scores kind of hang together a lot more. They're closer together in the extra X conditions, whereas for the extra Y conditions, they just kind of fanned out, and there was just a lot more variability across what parents were reporting in terms of the different types of psychopathology. So I'd like to take a quick moment to shout out a big thank you to my colleagues that co-authored the paper from which I presented some of these findings, but also more broadly, the members of our team at NIH who were integral in collecting the data that made this paper possible. So thank you for your time, and I'd be happy to take any questions you may have.